Okay. Hello, hello everyone. A very warm welcome and a happy reunion. We are so very thrilled that you're taking part in Trinity College's Reunion 2024 virtual offerings. My name is Shannon Garden-Smith. I am the current and outgoing chair of the Trinity College Alumni Association Executive, and it's my great pleasure to be the host and moderator of this afternoon's virtual session. But don't worry, you will be in fact hearing from real experts and not myself. Now, before we get started, a couple housekeeping items that I would like to cover. Many of us are quite familiar with this after many years of being on the Zoom world. But we do recommend that to improve your viewing experience, please select the speaker view versus the gallery view option, which is located hopefully still in the top of your Zoom screen. We have muted everyone for the purpose of the presentation, but not to worry. Following Kate and Rebekah's presentation, we will have some time for audience questions. If you have a question, please do submit the question through the Zoom Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer as many of these questions as we possibly can. One other item to note, we are recording today's session, which is fantastic for the purposes of uploading a recording to Trinity College's YouTube channel in the near future. Now, with that out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce you to this afternoon's speakers, Kate and Rebekah. So Kate MacDonald, the Nicholls Librarian and Library Director of the Graham Library. Kate began her career at Graham Library in rare and special collections cataloging, and more recently took on the role of Library Director. Kate is highly committed to student experience, the importance of rare and special collections, and is working strategically to incorporate new services and commitments to EDI and sustainability. Rebekah Bedard is Distinctive Collections Librarian. Rebekah has a background in rare and special collections outreach at Emory University and the City of Toronto Archives. She is currently the Instruction and Distinctive Collections Librarian at the Graham Library. Rebekah is dedicated to EDI, sustainability, and special collections outreach. She thoroughly enjoys building rare and special collections and making them available to a broader audience. A big welcome to Kate and Rebekah, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Shannon, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Shannon mentioned, I'm Kate MacDonald, the Nicholls Librarian and Director of Graham Library, and I am here with Rebekah Bedard, our Distinctive Collections Librarian, and we are sitting in one of our beautiful fireplace rooms in Graham Library today. Today, we're going to talk about our current exhibit at Graham Library, which is on the art of bookbinding. And that consists of a number of examples from our rare books collection, which was curated by Rebekah. But today, some of you may have seen the exhibit in person, but today we're going to leverage the Zoom technology, and we have multiple cameras, so we're going to take a closer look at some of the bookbinding details that you can't see very easily in the exhibit. And we will show some other selections from the collection that weren't part of the exhibit. So today we're focusing on European bookbindings from the hand press period. And so that is from about the time from the invention of the printing press in 1450 to the industrialization of bookbinding in the 19th century. So, you know, bookbindings, they're intended to provide protection of the text within, and they're a container for ideas conveyed through the text. But bookbindings are interesting to study because the materiality of the book provides information about the history of a society and culture that produced them. And we'll be talking more about that throughout the presentation. So when Gutenberg invented the printing press in the 15th century, it triggered an immense growth in the demand for books generally. They became easier, cheaper to produce, and in turn, it drove demand for bookbindings. And the bookbinding process was quite different from today. So while the printing was done on the press, the binding was all hand done. And books were not printed and bound at the same time. Instead, books would have been sold as sheets, and a purchaser could take them to a binder and choose what type of binding they would want according to their own taste and budget. So book bindings from that period were unique, handmade objects. And because of this, they can provide insight into the social and economic class of buyers and their intellectual interests during the time period. It can demonstrate how significant a text was. Was it a classic work, or was it something that was intended to be more ephemeral? Bookbinding also tells us about the aesthetic tastes and tools used during a time period and in specific regions. Binding techniques generally originated in the Near and Middle East, and then they moved northward through Europe following trade routes. And we'll see some examples today, but books could often be bound and rebound centuries after they were printed. But we can often date a binding and determine its age by looking at certain key features about the books. And we'll talk about that today. So I'm going to hand things over to Rebekah at this point, and she'll talk a bit about the process of bookbinding and the profession.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, so let's take a look together at the various parts of a book. This is a Bible from 1590, and we'll just take a look at some of the parts of a binding. So first we have the text block, which you can see here. It's essentially the sheets that you would get from the printer. And then the outer edge of the text block is known as the foredge. And the text block was sewn together with sewing supports, and headbands were added. You can see them a little at the top here. And then everything was attached to boards, and those were covered in covering material, usually leather. And then the book was decorated. You can see some of the decorations there. And then we can take a look as well at some of the steps in the bookbinding process. So first here, you can see the binder would gather sheets from the printer and put them together into sections, which were called quires. And then he would round out the spine of the book and add headbands at the top. He would lace the sewing supports into the boards, which you can see here, and then cover the binding with leather or another covering material. Leather was produced by a process called tanning. Essentially, tannic acid is used, and then you get these rich, dark covers. But skins could be treated in other ways as well. So for example, they could do something called alum tawing, soaking the skins in alum salts, which would result in a lighter cover. And we'll see both examples today. And then the binder would decorate the cover by pressing heated metal tools into the leather. Show you those up close. And so we have some examples here of tools that would be used in the bookbinding process. And those tools could include rolls that would have decoration on the edge, and those would just be rolled into the leather to create a decorative line. There's a few examples here. It's a little more floral. And you could also use tools with just an individual pattern on them. So you can see that little floral pattern, and that would just be heated and impressed into the leather. So we'll take a look as well at a damaged book. Damaged books can actually be quite helpful for understanding how books were put together. So this is a copy of Fulke's New Testament printed in 1589, and it has this simple 16th century English leather binding. But at some point, the book has suffered water damage, and that water damage allows us to see more of its structure. So for example, on the spine here, we can see the leather is peeling back, and we can actually see the sewing supports underneath the leather. And we can see the quires or the sections of paper sewn together. And then the leather is peeling off of the cover as well. So if we open it up, we can see that. See how the leather is peeling right off of the cover, and we can see the boards underneath. Sometimes these boards would be wood. These ones are pasteboard, so it's just pieces of paper stuck together. And we can see the edges where the leather would have been turned in around the boards, as well as where the sewing supports were laced in there. And then this sheet here is the paste down, and the paste down was essentially used to cover up these rough edges of the leather. And if we look at the paste down, we can see it's actually a piece of a medieval manuscript, and we'd never dream of doing this today. But during the hand press period, they used whatever paper was on hand, and they often recycled medieval manuscripts. And so you can see, because of the water damage, you can actually look on the other side of the paste down. This would have been stuck down initially. And we can see the beautifully illustrated medieval manuscript. So we've talked a bit about the bookbinding process, but what do we know about the bookbinders themselves? This is an image of a 16th century German bookbinders workshop, and it shows the sewing as well as the trimming and a wide array of bookbinders tools. And the binders themselves are a bit of a mystery. They didn't usually sign their work, but we have some information on their conditions of work. So generally, binderies were small operations. They'd sometimes be just on the ground floor of a house, and it would usually just be a few people working there, maybe a binder and a journeyman and an apprentice. And the binder may have his wife and daughters involved in the folding and sewing as well. And in the hierarchy of the book trade, binders were really at the bottom. Binding was seen as a more physical task compared to the more intellectual work of book selling or printing. But as we have seen, their work really involved great skill. So we'll look at some examples of bindings and see how they evolved over time, beginning in the 15th and 16th centuries. And I'll hand things over to Kate.
Thanks, Rebekah. So I'm going to show you some bindings from the 15th and 16th centuries. So during the time, especially during the 15th century, binding techniques still, they had much in common with the types of bindings and styles they would have used on medieval manuscripts. So the first item I'm going to look at today is, it's a Psalter from 1473. I'm just going to make sure it's on camera for all of you. So this is covered in what is called a limp vellum binding. And limp vellum bindings were common on medieval manuscripts. So the other thing I was going to talk about briefly is, so this item is also considered to be an incunable. And so within the first around 50 years of the printing press, the books that were published, you'll see that it still looks like a handwritten manuscript, like you would see in the Middle Ages, but it was actually done on a printing press. So limp vellum texts, they tended to be used for books that were more utilitarian or ephemeral because they were much cheaper to produce. So for example, this could include record keeping, or for books that were maybe teaching texts, for example, learning Latin or for learning basic Christian texts, or they might have been used for texts that people used for their own personal meditation on sacred works. So to produce vellum, animal skins were soaked in a lime bath without chemicals and dried under tension. So vellum was a cheaper option than leather over boards, but it was still relatively tough and durable. So unlike some of the other examples, one of them that Rebekah showed, this vellum cover, it does not have a board in it, so it's quite flexible. And you can see that the sewing is actually done to the text block. So this book, it's a Psalter, and it was one of the books of the Bible that was most likely to be bound separately for private devotional and liturgical purposes. So I would say I always like this one, even though it's not really going to be one of the most beautiful covers that you'll see today, but to me, this one is kind of the prime example of the connection between a user in the past, because we can see they had, so the print area, but if we go back further, there's a point where someone has added their own kind of rough notes to the book. So I can imagine that this one might have been for personal use and had personal meaning to someone in the past. So I'm going to move over to another example. This one was actually from around the same time period. It's Historia Scholastica by Peter Comester, and it was from 1479. So this is a biblical paraphrases book. It was also, the text was also printed in Germany. This was a very popular title. It was first written in the 12th century, but it was still popular around the advent of the printing press. So you can see, based on the binding I showed you and this one, though it's from around the same time period, there were clearly very different types of bindings on offer. So binders could provide their customers with choices of less expensive plain bindings and then slightly more decorative ones. So this one is an example of a simple Gothic binding, which was a popular style in the 15th century. And so these tended to be heavy and sturdy, like those of medieval manuscript bindings. They had, so you can see there's very thick sewing supports. It had very heavy wooden boards. You can see that's quite different than the vellum text I showed you. And then this one has clasps that, here, let me get my hands out of the way, that it can keep the book shut. And for some reason, I actually am not quite sure why, German and Dutch bindings tended to clasp their books at the top of the manuscript, whereas in France and in England, they preferred the bottom. So another interesting aspect of this book that you can see is that there's title information on the foredge, so on the text block. And so titles on the spine that we're used to today were not as common until really into the 12th century. And that was because until people and institutions were able to amass larger library collections, they weren't storing books vertically on dedicated bookshelves to the same extent that we do now and from the 17th century on. They'd often be put in cupboards or book chests, and the text would be facing outward. So the next item I'll show you is a confession manual from 1498. It was printed in Cologne, Germany. So this is an example of an early blind stamped calf binding with, looks like the original brass clasp. Now this binding, I'm going to try to hold it up so you can see. I just have to make sure the light catches this. As you can see, the binding has floral tooling on it. So as Rebekah showed earlier, they would have used tools and made these individual stamps on the cover. And this is another item that if we look inside, it has another manuscript fragment on it. And in this case, it looks like it's some medieval sheet music that has been used as to paste down this cover. This is a 1479 printing of the Lives of Popes. And you can see this one has a beautiful red leather binding. And because of the contrast, I think you should be able to see really well the tooling work again. I'm just going to lift it up a bit closer to the camera. And so when tools are simply pressed into the leather, that's called blind tooling. But later examples, the tooling was done and they'd add a thin layer of gold. And this is one example too, where this type, it has been repaired, but the original part has been retained on the binding, which is nice. Now this one is a book of letters by Marsilius Ficino from 1497. This was likely decorated with a roll. You can see the pattern that goes around. And it was also decorated with repeating diamond shapes. And in bookbinding, the repetition of geometric shapes is called the diaper design. And so one other notable feature of this is on the clasp, it has tulips as a motif. And although this book was printed in Germany, but it was by an Italian author, so it has 4 clasps, which was a style that they liked and preferred in Italy. Now this is the smallest one that I'm going to show you today. This is a copy of Virgil's works from 1527. And it was printed in Paris, but likely bound in England based on features like the clasps, which catch on the bottom. And in the 16th century, to save time, binders began to use stamps rather than individual tools. So I'm just trying to show this so it catches the light. So on the front, it's a scene depicting John the Baptist, and on the back is a scene showing the Annunciation. And these panel stamps were in style, particularly in England. In the 16th century, it wasn't always the case that covers would reflect their content, but pictorial stamps tended to depict religious images. So for my final book that I want to show you, this is Aurelia Ex Floribus, and was printed in 1475. So it's very beautiful printing, but you can see it has a very modern cover. So I wanted to show this to you for contrast. So this was bound by a binding company called Sangorski and Sutcliffe. And they were one of the most significant binding companies in the early 20th century, based out of London, England. And they were known for their high quality, beautiful bindings. So it's hard to know why the original binding was replaced. It could have been that it was in poor condition. It could have been a preference by a collector at some point in time. There could be many reasons, but you can see in comparison that we do, although it is very beautiful, we have lost some information about the history of the text when we aren't able to maintain their original bindings, but sometimes that has been necessary in the past to replace them. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rebekah to talk about 17th and 18th century bindings.
Thank you, Kate. So by the 17th and 18th century, more people owned their own books, and it became more common to see marks of ownership on bindings in the form of things like initials or coats of arms. And at this time, theological texts still continued to have more elaborate bindings than, say, literary ones, and most of the examples that we'll see are theological. So this is a Geneva Bible from 1603. It was donated to the library by the Right Reverend Lady Anne Tottenham. And the Geneva Bible was an English translation of the Bible created by Protestants who had escaped to Geneva under Queen Mary. And then when Queen Elizabeth came to power, they brought the Geneva Bible back again, and it became extremely popular in England among the people. It was the Bible used by William Shakespeare, for example. And King James had a strong distaste for it, in part because of marginal notes against monarchs, but ironically, the King James Version relied heavily on the Geneva Bible. So we mentioned that 17th century bindings sometimes included coats of arms, and on this one we can see the coat of arms of the Loftus family. And this Bible belonged to the Lord Chancellor of Ireland, Adam Loftus. The binding is embroidered, which was quite fashionable in 17th century England. A finely bound Bible would indicate the owner's wealth, literacy, and piety. But because of the fragility of fabric, few embroidered bindings survive today. So this is quite rare. And we can see if we look up close, the binding includes metal threads and embroidery silks, as well as applique work and stump work where it's raised above the cover. And similar styles were found on clothing and other textiles at the time. And you can see the book is small. I can hold it. It was intended for personal use and study, and you could carry it with you to church. But we'll look at an example now of a much larger book. So this is not a book that you would want to carry very far. It's a translation of the Bible by Martin Luther from 1630. And you can see it's this large, heavy book and a throwback to that 15th century Gothic style that Kate was showing us earlier. Gothic bindings weren't generally used by the 17th century, but they continued to be used for some Bibles and liturgical books, which were large and benefited from having a sturdier style. So this book may have been owned by a church and used during the liturgy. You can see this light cover. This is alum tod pigskin. We were talking about alum tod skin earlier, which is usually lighter. And it features metal clasps and metal furniture in the corners. And then this central piece is known as a boss. And it's not just decorative, it also would have helped to protect the cover. So as Kate was mentioning, books were often stored flat. This was probably stored flat in a lectern, and the boss would have protected the binding. So we have another small book for personal use here. It's quite a beautiful one. This is a divine office for Holy Week. So you can see it has prayers for different times of the day during Holy Week. And if we look inside, there's a handwritten note on the flyleaf here that says, Madame Adelaide de France, daughter of Louis XV. So Adelaide de France was the daughter of Louis XV and lived from 1732 to 1800, so during the French Revolution. and she had quite a large library with beautifully bound books. And this binding is red Morocco. Morocco is another name for goat skin because goat skin was often from Morocco. And you can see it's elaborately gold tooled. And in the center, you can see the coat of arms of France, the royal coat of arms, with 3 fleurs-de-lis topped by a crown and surrounded by a wreath. And there are also fleurs-de-lis on the spine there. And the foredge has been painted gold. And then this book also has beautiful end papers. These are called Dutch gilt end papers, and it was a popular style in the 18th century. You can see the shine from the gold. And they were generally produced in Germany and Italy and then shipped via Holland to France and England. And the decoration imitates the brocades and damasks of the period. So finally, we'll just look at 4 books of common prayer. The first 2 are in a simple style. These have concentric frames with florins at the corners. This was quite a popular style in 18th century England. And we can also see that they have beautifully decorated spines. And by this time, books were shelved with the spine facing outward. And we'll take a look at as well at some more elaborate books of common prayer. So first, this is a 1693 printing of the Book of Common Prayer with the central decoration and corner pieces all in silver. And then it has a simple tooled black leather binding. This is a style known as sombre, and it was popular in 17th century England for funerals and also for Lent. And then this is a Book of Common Prayer printed in 1775 with another beautiful red Morocco binding, which was quite popular at the time. And then if we look at the gold tooling, we can see some classical elements like these Greek key rolls around the edges and urns as well. So at this time, there was this real revival of classicism. And English bookbinding was also influenced by Rococo styles on the continent. And you can see those influences here. And another notable feature of this book is that we open it up. Inside the cover, we can see that it has this ticket. It says Daniel Ewing, May 26, 1777. What this is a binder's ticket. So by this point, binders finally started taking credit for their work, and we began seeing binder's tickets, and these became even more popular in the 19th century. And I'll turn things over to Kate to talk about 19th century binding.
So in the 19th century, bindings began to look much like the ones we're accustomed to today. So the 19th century brought great changes again to the book industry. There was an increase in literacy and an associated demand for the production of cheaper books. At the same time, there was greater mechanization happening, fueled by the Industrial Revolution. So printing was mechanized, and this is where we see the shift from handmade to machine-made books. And thus that was when the hand press period came to an end. So I'm going to start off this section with a day at the bookbinders. So I'm going to it's a bit tough to see. So I'm just going to put it up. Oh, is it upside down to everyone? So this is the image of a mid-19th century bindery. So by the second half of the 19th century, binderies had become large-scale operations with more factory-like assembly lines. So a variety of machines sped up this binding process, including machines for embossing and decorating cloth and leather, blocking presses for stamping, case binding machines, and book sewing machines. So this title that we're looking at now, it is The History of England. So this one was from 1870. Bookbinding did change dramatically. So to save money and to meet demand for books, binders began experimenting with cloth and paper bindings rather than full leather bindings. So like this one, they tried, there are quarter or half leather bindings than paper that represented most of the cover. They were cheaper than full leather, but they still were somewhat time consuming. During this time period, they also experimented with even cheaper options. Now, this doesn't look that beautiful, I'm sure, to all of you, but this was, let me open this up. This was an annual register or view of history and politics of the year 1854. So during this time frame, publishers began experimenting with just issuing items with paper or board covers. And in scholarship of bookbinding, there was a point where they thought that maybe the idea was that owners would rebind them, but they also just may have been published this way to provide cheaper options for the buying public, particularly for certain types of publications like proceedings, catalogs, and in this case, it's a periodical. One thing that was interesting about this one, though, was they would still reuse manuscript waste from other books, and this would have provided added protection to the binding, but then it would have been covered. And at this time, binding waste would include newspapers or catalogs or similar kind of ephemeral materials. Another example of new materials that they began experimenting with. So in 1820, a sturdy starch-filled cloth was developed for book bindings. And this was a major change that impacted the whole bookmaking process. So covers could be pre-made and glued to the text block. And this process is called case binding, and it's still used today. So by the second half of the 19th century, cloth bindings were dominant over leather bindings. And so this is an example of sacred allegories where we have publisher's binding of green cloth, and you can see it stamped in gold and black. And this one also includes, it's quite small, a binder's ticket. And it was bound by Byrne & Company. It says, and it was a family operated bookbinder that began using cloth bindings and steam-driven presses in the 1850s. For my last example, this is a title called The Hesperides in Noble Numbers. It was published in 1891. So with the adoption of cloth and the invention of machines, this led to the ability to mass produce trade bindings. At this time, artists and designers became involved in the decision making, and we can see that the covers, the pictorial designs often, well, was directly connected to the subject matter, unlike in earlier periods. So this one has an image of the Hesperides garden on the cover, and it's an example of a higher quality 19th century binding. So it's blue cloth stamped in gold. And this book was part of the Muses Library series, which was noted for its high quality book design. And that is my last example from the 19th century. So today, to conclude, mechanized bookbinding continues, and we're all accustomed to fairly inexpensive bookbindings and mass-produced items. But bookbinding is not a lost art. I'm sure many of you, maybe some of you do bookbinding or have gotten books bound yourself, but because there are still quite a number of fine binders who can still bind books by hand using older traditional methods of binding from the hand press period. And we also, I don't know if any of you are familiar with, Penguin has a cloth bound classics series printed within the last 10 years or so. And that saw the publication of classic works in linen, bound in hardcover with custom designs, and the linen comes in an array of colors, and it looks much like the book, the item I just showed you. And so I think we do still have an appreciation of beauty when it comes to bookbinding. So I wanted to thank all of you for joining us today, and so we could give you a brief overview of the history of bookbinding and to tell you about our collections. Before we take questions, we do want to thank, we've had many generous donors to Graham Library over the years who have donated a number of these items that we showed you today. We also want to thank Sharon Reed. She helped us set up our tech originally. I'm going to thank you. There was an invisible hand who was helping us with our book. Some of them were very heavy. So thank you to Heather Buchansky, who is our head of user services. And thank you to the development office for inviting us to participate in Reunion. Thank you.
We'll open it up for questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kate and Rebecca. That was incredibly informative. I'm seeing lots of gratitude in the Q&A function over here as well. There are a couple of questions that have already been entered into the Q&A. But maybe before we get started with those, is it possible, do you have some of the last books that you just showed us? Is it possible to show us those again, and maybe just flipping the book around so our audience can see maybe that last one or the last couple ones?
Sure.
Right side up. There was a request for that chat. Can folks see that?
One. Were there any others?
Great.
That was
so beautiful.
From the Muses Library, and here is the Sacred Allegories.
Wonderful. I mean, really, we did see a lot. Even with them upside down, you get a sense of incredible patterning.
See, I knew there would be, the viewers can't see that we have multiple cameras, and you have to remember what is facing you is not facing the audience the way we have this set up.
A beautiful coming together of more ancient technologies with the most contemporary. It's a lot to handle. Thank you for that. So I do want to get to some of these questions in the chat. So earlier on in the presentation, you showed us a leather book that had been damaged due to water damage. And Christine asks about that book specifically. Is there a common way or a way that conservators can stabilize that kind of appealing leather cover? Christina says it looks fascinating, including the water damage, and it shows us so much.
We'll just re-show that one.
So here it is. And that's a great question. Thank you. So in terms of caring for an item like this, there would be various options. I mean, for one thing, all of the books here are now stored in our rare book room, our Saunderson rare book room, which is temperature and humidity controlled. So there wouldn't be any further damage. We like to keep this one as is because it's a great teaching tool. But say we didn't, we could take it to a professional binder and have it rebacked. They would add leather to the spine and also try to affix this original material to that leather. And they are skilled in doing that. They would probably try to attach this again. Libraries at one point would take damaged bindings and have them replaced with new bindings, and we don't do that anymore because we've seen that we can learn so much from even damaged bindings. Is there anything you'd add to that, Kate?
I guess I just add, we have something going out for conservation, and it is a trained conservator who will have various interesting techniques to, as Rebekah said, repair parts of the book and clean all of the pages, but they definitely are dedicated to preserving the original parts of the binding now.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. Thank you for the question and for the response. Peter asks, this is a specific question, what is the best preservative for dry leather covers? Peter has used a lanolin-based British Museum cream, which a professional bookbinder criticized as being damaging.
I would say I would leave that to a conservator in my case, because we are not experts in conservation. So I cannot commit to recommending a certain conditioner because I don't feel I'm qualified. What would you say?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would chat with a conservator. There are also professional bookbinders and people who do restoration as well. So for example, in Toronto, there's a company called Big River Bindery that does binding and restoration. So someone like that may be able to give advice.
I was going to say, to add though, sometimes certain practices in conservation were believed to be, the best at some period in time, but then later changed later on. I don't know if it often inevitably comes up that people will ask why we're not using white gloves. I don't know if that's in the questions, but there was a point in time where people thought you should have the white archival gloves to handle books, but we don't really do that except with certain types of materials in the archives. Just because those gloves don't really fit very well, and it's better just to wash your hands, make sure your hands are clean and you have better dexterity. But that was an example, say, of a changing practice over time.
Yeah, that's great. I've been just recently in the last couple of years, I've noticed that and was terrified at first to be touching these beautiful books, but it feels, as you say, you have a lot more dexterity actually, with just clean hands.
And they've lasted so long. They've been through so much over hundreds of years, and the materials they used were quite resilient.
Truly. There are some more really excellent questions in the chat that I'd like to try to get us to. So Amy asks if you can explain a little bit more the reason for actually cutting pages. Amy mentions that this has been explained to her before, but she forgets the kind of connection between the cutting of the pages to printing and binding.
Sure, I can take that. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you for the question. So, would it be possible to get the copy of the blue and white annual register? I think it's yeah. I think that one has pages that are attached. Okay, so the question is about cutting paper. And this one, you can see, do you see how the pages are still attached at the top? So when books were put together, when they were at the printers, there would be a big sheet of paper. And if you fold that sheet of paper in half once and print on it, that would be a book called a folio. So those are generally large books. If you then fold that again, that would be a quarto. So you'd have to print 4 pages on each side, and then so on. And so those pages would be then folded and sewn together to make the text block. And you would need to remember to trim or cut at the top of the book or wherever the fold is. And sometimes that's not done. You can see here that step hasn't been taken yet. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Amy, feel free to follow up if you have a follow-up question with that. It's so great to see these moments too, where there's maybe, oh, Amy says, thank you so much. These moments where maybe something hasn't been attended to or damage has happened and actually shows us so much more about the process. I am going to skip forward. I will come back to, there are a couple more questions in between, but Paramjit asks, oh, sorry, I've just lost the question now. Do you also have non-Western items in your collection? And I'm sure that you do, but maybe you can tell us a bit more.
We do have a few. I wouldn't say, so our main, given Trinity College's history, our main rare books and special collections strength is in Reformation theology and that history. We do have a few items that have come to us through faculty members long past that we actually have to do more research on because they're so few in number, and before we share with everybody what they are, we need to figure out what did come to us. But there were a couple examples of Ethiopian manuscripts. So what else, Rebekah? There's a fragment, a papyrus fragment, a Greek one. But our collection, just given the history, it is more European focused.
Yeah, great to note that. Christina has a follow-up and has sent some links to other libraries at the University of Toronto that might have collections that specialize a little bit more in non-Western materials, and perhaps if you know of others, you can mention those to us as well. Okay, I'm just going to move back a little bit in the Q&A chat. So we have a general question that I think is wonderful in opening up however you might want to answer this. But Yobi asks, what are the challenges of bookbinding? So I'm sure there are many, but perhaps you can just give us a couple of the challenges that you're kind of most interested in your work as working with this collection.
I guess one, as we've been talking about, the challenges, say, as librarians and caretakers of the materials is, one, it is very expensive to conserve items, but figuring out the balance between how much do we want to conserve and preserve, or does the actual repair, should the repair of, say, a binding take precedence depending on its condition? So I would say maybe that's one aspect. I don't know, what would you?
Yeah, in terms of the materiality and process of bookbinding, we are by no means experts in actually making book bindings, but we did host a few bookbinding workshops at the library to do simple bookbinding together back in the spring, and those were wonderful. We had a chance to invite alumni as well as students, and everyone got to work together. And actually having the opportunity to create the book bindings yourself, you see just how involved it is. We were doing a very simple process, but it's still very involved with all of the stages and the sewing and so on. So you can imagine how involved it would be to, create these early bindings. And I think that's probably part of the reason that in the 19th century, as Kate was discussing, they moved to more mechanized modes of creating book bindings. But the early book bindings are so beautiful, and by and large, they stand up, I would say, much better than the more industrialized book bindings that we see later. The materials are stronger and everything is sewn together so beautifully. So even though it's a more involved process, it's really rich, and it's great to see that some people are still carrying on those early traditions of bookbinding today.
That's great. Thank you so much. Perhaps the beginning of many more sessions to come. There are a couple other comments here. Maureen adds, I think in response to your discussion earlier, Maureen adds that in Quebec, many of the books in French are purposefully bound in regular paper because purchasers were expected to rebind them, so their library's appearance would be uniform. Is that something you had mentioned that sometimes did happen?
Yeah, so that example I showed you during the 15th and 16th century section, that's one I wonder they might have been rebound in the early 20th century to look more uniform with the rest of the items in someone's personal collection. So it was quite common practice at different points in time.
Yeah, and in the hand press period, basically you would go to the printer or bookseller and buy just a stack of printed sheets. And then you would take them to the binder yourself, as Kate was mentioning, to have them bound. So you would really have some say over how your book was bound.
Incredible. Thank you. Okay, I think maybe the last question that we might have time for, and you may or may not have the expertise in this, but Christina asks, do we have conservators on staff at the University of Toronto libraries as a larger entity?
Yes, there are other libraries larger than we are who are fortunate enough to have conservators on their full-time staff. So Fisher does. I was trying to think, does Kelly have Kelly Library at St. Mike's? They will, I believe. So it's fortunate if we have questions, we have people we can consult with. Or we have a network of conservators whom we work with.
Yeah, that's great. Again, revealing the kind of immense amount of expertise that goes into caring for these collections. So that does bring us to 1 p.m. I think probably I think I've gotten through most of the questions in the chat. I want to again thank you, Rebekah and Kate, for a really wonderful, informative, generous presentation. I personally learned a lot, and as we've spoken about, I look forward to visiting the Graham Library again soon. So
yes, please do. And we would invite anyone who is with us today to come in. How long is the exhibit up for?
It's open until June 27th. So you can come and see some of the books that we looked at today in person, and there are more in the exhibit.
Exciting. Okay, amazing. So if you're able to come and visit the exhibition before June 27th. So again, thank you. And on behalf of Trinity College, as well as the Office of Development and Alumni Affairs, Thanks to everyone for attending today. We hope to see you virtually and in person at our other upcoming reunion events over the coming days. So thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, everyone.